Today we're going to be checking out 007, not James Bond, the D007. A new budget retro handheld from AliExpress that seriously impresses. The D007 is yet another vertical retro handheld that's come onto the market that fits into the budget category. I managed to pick mine up for around about £35 and you can find them for around about that price, which is an absolute steal for what is a pretty awesome console that compares very well to some Powkiddy and Anbernic devices. Now, as we said, the D007 is a vertical handheld console and it's a bit of a mashup between the Powkiddy RGB20s and the Anbernic 353VS. A lot of retro gaming vertical handhelds these days follow a similar form factor, and the only difference is really being in the types of shoulder buttons that they've got or the placement of the analog sticks. And for me, the D007 does a good job in the design and look of the console. Some noticeable things about it are that the D-pad and the actual buttons are pretty big, quite a lot bigger than some of the other variants we've seen on the 353PS and on the RGB20s. In terms of the buttons, I prefer that, but in terms of the D-pad, I'm still on the fence because if you're playing games that require you to move around the D-pad pretty quickly, you've got more area to cover with it being a bigger D-pad as opposed to a smaller D-pad where you can just slide around the thing basically. The analog sticks are in the lower position on the console, which is fine with me, and they are recessed like a lot of pocketable handheld consoles now do. There is a little issue with the analog sticks which I will mention in a bit, but moving on to the back, and the shoulder buttons are pretty chunky but easy to use and you're not going to do any mishits by accident. But around the back is where the D007 does vary, and it's got a pretty hefty booty. What I really like to see with handhelds these days is the focus on ergonomics, because a lot of people are put off by handhelds because they don't have the same comfort factor of a console controller. So when handhelds put in these extra bumps for ergonomics, I really like to see that. For example, the RG405V is one of my favorite new consoles, mostly because of how it feels in your hand. It just feels like a pleasure to use. And the D007 does a great job as well. Having these bumps on the back where you can really grip the console, especially with it being a vertical console, makes it a lot more comfortable, and it was something that I really like to see. Now, overall quality of the D007 is pretty decent, to be fair. It isn't as solid as something like a 405V, or to be honest, a 35XX, but it does feel very similar to a 353VS, which is kind of funny because the 353VS is a more expensive console than 35XX, but I always felt like the 35XX just felt a bit more solid. Maybe that's because it had fewer buttons, so it was a little less space for rattling around with the buttons moving. Like the 353VS, there is a little bit of rattling from the back buttons. But in all honesty, this is a very solid and well-built console, and the plastic doesn't feel cheap and tacky. It's not the most high premium quality of plastics, but it's definitely really good quality for the price range that it's at, and the price range is what really interests me. Now, the D007 comes packed with an RK3326 quad-core processor, which is the same processor we see on the RGB20s, and more interestingly, the same processor we see on the RG351MP. A fantastic retro handheld from Anbernic. On top of that, it also packs a G31 Mali GPU. Now, to put it into context, these days, the RGB20s will set you back around about $60, and the RG351MP is still selling on the Anbernic site for $136, albeit it's got a metal shell, but in terms of performance, it shares a lot of the same innards as the D007, which you can pick up for £35. This is what makes the D007 really, really interesting to me, and a great option for anybody looking to get into the retro gaming handheld scene. On top of that, unlike the M17 we checked out recently, the screen on the D007 is actually really good and doesn't have any crappy plastic over the top of it, making it difficult to see in the sunlight. It's a very crisp, clear screen and has a great 4:3 aspect ratio for all the games that it's emulating. We'll get onto emulation in just a second, but just to round off the physical features, the D007 feels like a console you can take with yourself anywhere, not worry too much because it feels pretty solid in case you drop it, and it has as much pocketability as any of the current vertical form retro gaming handhelds, even with its big booty. Now, emulation on the D007 boasts up to N64 and PSP emulation, but similar with the M17 we looked at recently, the N64 and PSP emulation is pushing it quite a bit. Now, it does perform better than the M17, but you're still going to have games where there's issues, where there's stutter and slowdown, meaning that N64 and PSP is either going to be hit or miss, or you're going to be playing games not at the best of their capability. However, everything up to the PS1 generation is absolutely brilliant, and with this having a 4:3 screen, it's an absolute pleasure to play those systems on this. Now, button mapping wasn't always spot on. For example, with PSP games, the triangle button, the equivalent anyway, wasn't at the top, it was on the left. You can easily go into the menu and change these. It's actually super simple and really easy to do, but you just like to see these consoles come in with emulators pre-set up. You want to see the control preset as well. Not a big issue, nothing that can't be fixed, but just something that was noticeable. The UI on the D007 is a little bit of a strange one for me because it comes with Android 10, but it's a very restricted version of Android. It doesn't give you the flexibility or the freedom that a 353V would give you, for example. So for me personally, I would have preferred to have seen a Linux operating system, something like we see on a lot of budget handhelds these days with a really nice user interface. The user interface on the 007 is pretty much the same kind of experience. You're still going through consoles, you're still jumping in and selecting the game with loads of screenshots and everything. But the little pop-ups and the little hints of Android just make me think, maybe they should have just gone for Linux with this. Either way, it doesn't really get in the way. It's more of a preference thing in my eyes. And it is still 100% as user-friendly as any of those Linux handhelds I keep on going on about. And if you want to pack in some more games as well, you can just pop out the SD card and put any games you want on there for these emulators. Now, the D007 is a very well-made and pretty powerful handheld for £35. But there was one issue that I did have, and I feel like it might just be with my device, and I hope it's just with my device. The analog sticks, because they're recessed and they also have this little LED that goes around them, which is a nice little extra touch, I feel like the movement of them is slightly restricted. And in most scenarios, 9 times out of 10, that doesn't really make a difference at all. You can get as much range of motion as you need in the games and moving the characters about as you need. But there was this small scenario, this small edge case where on the left analog stick, if I'm pushing diagonally up and right, it doesn't seem to pick up that movement. And I feel it's been restricted a little bit too soon by the edge of the LED strip. Now, like I say, it doesn't present itself as a big issue, but in games that are going to require that diagonal or for moving around a little bit more flexibly, I did notice the issue. I feel like this might be a one-off with the handheld that I've got, and hopefully won't present itself in other handhelds because the right analog stick doesn't have that issue, and no other areas of the left analog stick are showing that issue as well. So I might open it up and tinker about a little bit and see if I can maybe fix it or shave the edge of the little bit of plastic that's restricting it. But in all honesty, for £35 with the power of this handheld, that's the only issue I've found. And I think the D007, despite having an awesome name anyway, is a fantastic option for anybody looking to get into retro gaming and doesn't want to blow a lot of money. Links to the D007 will be in the description below. But if you want to check out some other awesome budget options, check out this video right here.